There we go.
Okay. I hope everyone is in the room, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on leading in the 2020s and beyond. My name's Mark Withers, and I'm founder of Mighty Waters Consulting. Now, I hate doing the maths these days, but I've been working in the field of leadership and organisational development for nearly 40 years now, working with leadership teams and boards across very different sectors. I'm delighted to be your host for this afternoon's discussion and to be joined by two special people, Paula Leach and Ben Renshaw. Before they introduce themselves, I just want to say that Paula really has been a catalyst behind today's discussion. The publication of her book, Vantage Points, is something we are here to celebrate, and it has provided us with this perfect excuse to gather such a wealth of experience on the call today. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you when we open up the conversation for questions and comments later. Now, before we plunge into the discussion, Paula and Ben, could you say a few words by way of introduction?
Yeah, shall I start, Mark?
Yes, please.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much. And hello and welcome to everybody here. I'm so delighted to welcome some great friends and colleagues onto the call today, as well as the opportunity to make some new connections. So delighted you're all with us. It's been my privilege over 25 years to work alongside and partner and observe leaders in different functions and sectors and geographies, and on all different levels as well, as an HR professional. And I've been an exec myself as Chief People Officer at the Home Office and more latterly with FDM Group. And my passion, and for those of you who know me, I am very passionate about this, is partnering amazing leaders to step up into their greatest potential as 21st century leaders. So I now run my consultancy, Vantage Points Consulting, providing executive coaching, advisory services. And this summer, I'm very excited about this, launching the Vantage Points Foundation, which is supporting young women to reach for their dream careers. And when I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, age 9, I was absolutely clear that I wanted to be an author. So to actually achieve this a few decades later in my life shows that with enough passion and determination, we can achieve our dreams. And Vantage Points was published in February this year. Thank you.
Ben, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Paula. And it's great to be with you together. Thank you for the invitation. Paula, many, many congratulations. Fantastic. On the publication of Vantage Points. And yeah, look, it reminds me, I remember, probably nearly 20 years ago when I wrote my first book, and I thought it was a dream of mine as well to write. I was useless at school. I actually grew up as a classical violinist at the Yehudi Menuhin School, and academia was very secondary to me. And my father was my own headmaster. And I remember when I got the book deal, he thought I was having a joke, and that his son had actually landed a book contract. I remember I was contracted to write 60,000 words, and the first 120,000 got binned. But the next iteration was a bit more relevant. I'm now completing my 10th book that comes out this year. So it's a wonderful thing. So I work in the area of 3 areas: executive coaching, team development, leadership development, and I'm just really excited to contribute to the conversation today.
Thank you both. Now, the one thing that we've all become experts in over the last 12 months is using these virtual tools. So I want to encourage you to use the chat box to share reflections on what's been said, and also to post some questions. Please stay on mute unless you're called upon to speak. But during the course of our discussion, I, along with Francesca Stainer from LID Publishing, will be keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll be inviting some of you to contribute later. Just to say, we will be recording the webinar, and a link will be sent to you afterwards. so you can listen in again and also pass on the link to others in your network. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to pose a question in terms of leadership. So many books have been written about leadership over the decades. So Paula and Ben, what's inspired you to choose to write about leadership? Paula, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, well, so the book is probably, well, it's probably my whole career in the making in some ways, but it certainly was 3 years before I wrote it in my mind. And it started off actually as a particular model that I was developing, and then grew and grew as I started to contemplate the fact that I might actually put pen to paper and actually write this book. And the background to it is really based on my observations and experiences over all those years working alongside leaders and being a leader myself, and contemplating how complex we sometimes can create leadership to be. And I always find, so there's two things really. I always find, A, that when things get complex, the most important thing to do is to try and create simplicity. Because to create simplicity means that you can take action. And when things are complex, it's actually quite difficult to create clear action for others to be able to see. So creating that simplicity, I wanted to kind of bring it back to that. And I was also conscious of, as a practicing chief people officer, as a practicing HR professional, there were very similar themes to the types of things I was talking to leaders about. And it was very much the same type of activity, which is really trying to help people, bring them back to, and what is the most important contribution you as a leader can make in this situation, not as a technical expert, not as the functional head, you know, etc., but as a leader in this situation. And so the concepts of the book were born out of that. And that, you know, just in real simple terms, it's basically, you know, an equation. If a leader's responsibility is to move something from A to B, or to help move something from A to B, then they have two main jobs to do. One is to create clarity, and the other is to get out of the way and create space. And to help people to do that, they have almost what I call the keys to the castle, which is the ability to see things from lots of different perspectives because of their unique position. And they are the vantage points. So that's hence the title of the book. So using those different vantage points, and I split them into 5 different vantage points for the book, you can then perform those 2 key jobs of creating clarity for yourself and others, and getting out of the way, enabling the collective agency of others to move things from A to B. And I just felt really compelled to share that message more widely, really, because it's what I'd been effectively coaching people on, and coaching myself on as a leader as well over the years. Yeah.
Thanks. We'll come back to some of those points that you made there, Paula. But Ben, what inspired you to write about leadership?
Look, being really honest, I think one of the primary things was just seeing really poor leadership. You know, in my work as a coach, I was very much on the receiving end of the impact of bad leadership on people's lives and on their careers. And, you know, to the point of literally people being shattered by bad communication, bad decision-making, bad performance management. I mean, just, and that's always been a real fuel for me in terms of my stance is better leaders for a better world. What I see very, very clearly is the impact of leadership, not only on people's careers, but their lives as well. And of course, you know, in a climate like now today, this is absolutely evidenced in a very tangible way, for instance, in terms of back to office. And how do we create the, you know, what are the conditions and the environment for people to return to work after what we've all experienced in terms of COVID and a global pandemic. Where I'm seeing leaders manage that really well is they're being very, very sensitive. They're really listening. They're providing very empathetic guidance. And of course, we contrast that with other leaders who have had to resign some very, very visible roles. Why? Because of the complete lack of awareness and lack of sensitivity to people's lives and needs. So it's for me, leadership is incredibly tangible. It's it's how you run business, it's how you engage people, it's how you provide for customers, it's supply chains, etc., etc. It's a very, very tangible role, and therefore my absolute drive is to ensure that leaders do their best possible job, and they're held accountable to that.
Yeah, great. I mean, I like these ideas of doing the best possible job, being held accountable. And Paula, I'm fascinated by the idea of simplicity, because we hear so much about leaders having to do with complexity at the minute. And I'd like to just pick up on that sort of theme in terms of how do we not overcomplicate leadership and yet deal with some really difficult challenges as leaders in our organizations. Let me throw that one out there, see if you pick that one up.
Yeah, well, so I suppose over the years I sit there and I try and think, well, what is the lowest common denominator of, not the lowest common denominator, but the simplest way I can address any situation. And I simply come back to these 2 points around, what is it that as a leader, and I do really agree with Ben's point that, we have as leaders an absolute privilege and responsibility to take the job of leadership seriously. And I think many people do, and it's really hard, many people do end up sort of slightly accidentally in leadership because they're really good at some of the things that they're doing, etc. And it's really hard. And it's really hard when you're busy and you're being pulled in lots of directions, and you get drawn into that busyness, and you get drawn into the reactiveness, and you get drawn into the complexity. The greatest thing a leader can do is step back and create enough space to ask themselves a simple question, which is, what is the most impactful thing I can do in this situation to move things forwards? What is the most impactful thing I can do in this situation to enable other people? Because the leader isn't the person who's actually making everything happen. It's the collective agency they're creating in others. And so you have to give yourself enough space to be able to reflect and then move. And it's that dynamism between creating the space to stop and pause, and then getting back into the fray with people and communicating and engaging, etc., that's really, really important. And I feel that supporting leaders to feel that they have the agency themselves to take that step back, because it's as much about your ability to reflect and create that positive momentum as it is about doing anything as a leader. I know Ben will have a point of view about this, having written, a book all about being, but it is what you represent that's most important. And I think as a leader, being able, and the reason I put these 2 clear questions in there, these 2 clear jobs, creating clarity and getting out of the way, so I'd find it difficult actually for anyone to share with me an example where it isn't helpful as a leader to ask yourself a question, which of those 2 things am I doing at the moment? And if I'm not doing one of those 2 things, I could probably be getting involved in things that are not most important for me to be involved in as the leader.
Yeah.
And it's that understanding of what the job is that I think is the real differentiator. And then, as I say, creating the space to be able to be thoughtful about how you choose to create an impact.
Yeah. Ben, do you want to amplify what Paula has said?
Probably helpful if I come off mute first. No, look, I love it, and I, really resonate. I do want to pick up on this, just point around the simplifying complexity, because, again, it's, Mike, as an example, look, I was working with a coaching a team this morning. They're in technology, very, very, very complex technology. They do, you know, really advanced kind of creative work, but their biggest challenge is just rigor and rhythm and project management and delivering for customers on time and meeting deadlines and all that good stuff. And you know, we were having this conversation around, because they've just done a rebrand, they're bringing their values into the business. How do they do that in a consistent and authentic way? And they've got this real tension in terms of retaining their heritage and the magic of their creativity, and at the same time bringing in the rigor in terms of delivery. And so again, I just think, you know, having the time to step back and think and reflect and create clarity and alignment is number one for me as a leader. You know, because again, what I see is leaders are so busy and they're doing so much stuff that again, that can pose a real risk then in terms of being able to really step back and think clearly. And then secondly, then you've really got to take people with you on the journey, and engagement is key. And for me, the fundamental piece of engagement is trust. So if I look at, you know, well, what really is engagement? It's about a currency of trust. And so therefore, how do you generate that trust, you know, again, in a virtual world, but through the transparency, through the vulnerability. And what's turned a lot today is around the psychological safety. So really creating the conditions, environments where people have voice, they can speak up and feel safe to be themselves. So those are just some of the thoughts that come to mind.
Great, great. So I think we're up and running, and I'd like to bring it to the now. So the theme for today is the 2020s and beyond. So what's different about some of the leadership challenges now that are different to the ones that maybe we experienced 10 or 20 years ago? And how do those sort of project themselves into that beyond piece? So.
Well, my thinking about this is about a lot of what's happened over the last year, I think, has accelerated things that were already in train. And, you know, and a huge amount of that is driven by not just globalisation, but also significantly technology changes. So what we're leading and managing has fundamentally shifted. We're not leading tasks anymore. Just like prior to task, we were leading, you know, people who were creating manufacturing, all that was automated. The next phase has been this AI automation of task. That, you know, the shift moving forwards is partly driven by the fact that we are leading something completely different, and that is the human technology interaction and the human to human interaction. We're leading that. We're not leading individual people working on tasks. So that, I think, is the first thing. And that has fundamentally been accelerated very quickly. The second key change is therefore about that human to human interaction and that very human aspect. I think this is so exciting, by the way, because I feel like we've come so full circle over the last sort of couple of centuries, really, since we went into the Industrial Revolution. We are now back in a position where technology has caught up with us, and we are now able to really work together as humans on the very thing that created our effectiveness as a kind of a species, if you like, if I can get really kind of systemic about this. And that is, we're successful as a species because we're innovative, because we're creative, and because we have social connection. And we have now moved beyond needing to lead task, and we are now back to leading human connection for the next shifts forward. And that requires a leadership who are empathetic, who understand people and what it takes to engage the best out of people, to be inclusive, and to create that ability to thrive in uncertainty, to be able to move forwards when everything is not completely clear. And I suppose that's the definition of the complexity. So to me, it's those things that have shifted. They were shifting anyway. I think they've been absolutely accelerated over the last year. And I'm doing a little bit of research at the moment, and I know I can see some lovely people on the call today who have already been part of that research. And some of the key things that are coming out of this are absolutely a focus on empathy and a focus on being able to manage through uncertainty. They're themes that are coming through from everybody, and that requires humanity and leadership that is unavoidable. I'd love to know what Ben's experience is of that, but there's certainly the themes that I think are exciting, but also going to be challenging because it is a shift.
Well, Ben, come on in on that, because you already mentioned empathy and sensitivity and emotional intelligence. So
yeah, no, look, absolutely. And I'm just going to bring it to life with a couple of real life examples that I'm working with at the moment. So I do a lot of work for London Underground, and, you know, it's one of the, you know, keep London moving, one of the most challenging operational environments I would suggest in the country. And Paula, you know, you're absolutely on the money there. So they've just integrated two functions, customer and operations. And the director there, who's a remarkable man, and his whole ethos as a leader is humanity. And even before he started, so he started on April the 1st, he was heading up operations before. So that's all the trains, and then they're bringing in customer as well. So it's accountable for about 11,000 colleagues. It's obviously the largest part of London Underground. And so even before he started, 2 weeks before, we brought both teams together, 32 people, and it was all about fostering trust. And the way that we did that was through storytelling and being vulnerable. We allowed everybody 3 minutes to share their story, what has shaped them, what's most important to them. And an example, one of the most hardened operators, he's been there 37 years prior, and they're busy. They're seriously busy in terms of delivery. And, you know, he wrote beforehand saying, look, wasted time. Why are we doing this? You know, we just need to get on and deliver. And he had the grace afterwards to write back and saying that was absolutely the right judgment call. And what we were able to do was break down barriers, create an environment of trust in a virtual environment, and really set the tone for the future in putting humanity into action. One other quick example, I do a lot with Heathrow Airport, and the director that took over security recently. And so he's got, you know, 4,500 colleagues. Again, it's securing the nation. He's, you know, you're dealing with a very, very complex, sensitive environment there. And he came from the commercial sector, no experience in operations. But what he's brilliant at is creating trust and engaging people. And, you know, Heathrow has been ravaged, absolutely ravaged as a business during this year with COVID, losing 50 million a week. And, you know, it's very, very challenging times. They've gone through strikes. Again, they've got tough unions. One of the only parts of the business that did not go on strike was security. Why? Because they're engaged, they believe, and there's an environment of trust there. So I see very tangible examples when you talk about, you know, humanity to humanity, putting this into action, absolutely at the front line in some of the most operationalized and heavily unionized environments in this country. It can be done and it works.
We're having some great comments and questions coming through on chat. And one of the comments has been about building trust and that connection, that social connection, the humanity in a virtual environment. And Ben, you mentioned that some of your clients are doing that quite well. What are they doing particularly well that's really been able to kind of get past the screen and actually kind of touch the heart of people?
Look, Paula mentioned earlier that I write a lot about being. I make a distinction, you know, that we're human beings, we're not human doings. And in a world of task and transaction, it's very easy for the doing to take over. So for me, leaders that do this well, they're very deliberate about being, and they actually utilize that in their language. And for instance, with London Underground, we frame meetings in terms of we've got being meetings and doing meetings. So people are very clear. And a being meeting is absolutely, it's time to think. It's about connectivity. It's about relational. It's about leadership conversations. And so again, there's a very strategic intent with that. So it's not you got to be very deliberate in terms of, we are creating this time and space for this reason. And then on the back of that, you obviously then, bring in tools that support. So one tool that we use is what's called a check-in. Now, a check-in is simply what's on your mind, what's keeping you awake at night. In this time where people have been, there's been so, as Paula was talking about, the unpredictability, the uncertainty, there's been so much of that going on. Literally, particularly in an operational environment where things change every day, you need to check in daily, weekly, in order to give people that headspace to think, what is going on, where am I? So we use a check-in. The leaders that do this well, they use check-in, and they really give it time. This is not, just a secondary thing. And then what we did was we've taken really big topics. So things like inclusion, well-being, resilience, mental health, these really important leadership topics, and leaders are given them time to talk, time to reflect, time to think about this stuff, ultimately then obviously leading to better decision making and action. So for me, you got to do it by example. It's not an afterthought, it's strategic, it's deliberate, and you're not afraid to put the thorny issues on the table.
Great, thank you. Paula, anything for you to come in on the back of that?
Yeah, I will, because I really agree with the point about time, because I feel that sometimes as leaders, in this busyness, in this complexity, it's extremely difficult to prioritize time for being. The other key thing that I think makes a huge difference here, and I think it's heightened in the virtual world. I don't think it's unique to the virtual world, but I actually think we've got a real opportunity with the virtual world to get better. Social connection is built on reciprocity. So you get what you give. Feelings are based on reciprocity. So if I give a little of myself, I will get something back from you. And it's not because I'm doing that for some, other reason. It's because that's what builds connection, and that's what builds relationships. If you think about any relationship that you've got, it's built on this gradual build of trust through reciprocity. I share something that makes me vulnerable with you. You will share something that makes you vulnerable with me. As a leader, our most valuable commodity is information. If we don't know what's going on, and I know I've got people on the call, I know Matt's on the call, who've done a lot of work about data and information about feelings. I'm sure he'll have something to say about this in a minute. But, if you don't know how people are feeling in your organization, we know how much distraction that can cause, because you're on one path and other people are on this other path over here. It's really, really important. The only way you access, or have the privilege to access, how another person is feeling is by sharing how you feel. And I think as a leader, and so I loved your point about being an example, Ben, because I think it's more than just creating the time for it. You also have to show up as it as well. You have to show up as that type of connection that you want to create, and then you will have it back in spades. And the final thing I was going to say on this was, I had such a beautiful conversation with an HR head in a small financial services firm last week, and we were discussing leadership. And you'd think financial services, and maybe not, you'd see some of this. Well, in this particular firm, they were really focusing on this reciprocity, the space, the discovery together, those types of things, the feelings. And what she described was an organization that was so busy, run off its feet, flat out, not space for anybody really. And yet they had about 6 additional projects, and everyone was involved in the additional projects. We're getting 150% discretionary input from people because they felt a sense of belonging and they felt seen and heard. And that's the differential, I think. And so the leader's job is to cultivate that and curate that by being it themselves. And that's really feels sometimes, I think, for many people like the leader that you spoke about, Ben, who have been leading a certain way, maybe holding back those feelings, like jumping off a cliff. Because actually what we do know is that in order to do that, you have to be quite comfortable in yourself in order to be able to do that. And that comes back to this whole point about leadership is about you and your self-awareness, and you bring all of that to the human connections you're trying to create.
Yeah, it's a very different image you're painting from being the boss, isn't it? And your image about jumping off the cliff, Lorna in the comments talks about the leap of faith, and this point about reciprocity. I can only say that once on a webinar without having to put my teeth in. But it's absolutely resonating with folk out there. And a couple of other things, trust, that centrality of trust in the team. But I want to come to a point that Marina Bolton has made. By the way, Mark Thompson, thank you very much for those points around trust. Marina's talked about humility, and this issue of ego in leadership is one that perhaps we bury under the carpet sometimes. But that sense of showing up, being vulnerable, being humble, the capacity to say sorry. Marina, I'm reading your points here, when things go wrong. What have you seen that's really part of this future role for leaders that we need to take us into the challenges of the future?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to respond to that, and then love to hear Paula's thoughts. Again, just using examples. So so I coach one CEO in Americas. It's a great brand. They're a chocolate company. It's a lot of fun, and very ambitious, very driven. It's all about doubling the size of the business and all that good stuff. But he does that in a way which is quite remarkable. So firstly, he's very, very purpose-led. So the company has a core purpose. They actually describe that purpose as make life a bite better, which is quite good for chocolate. And but his mantra for the business is progress, not perfection. And they're actually owned by a European company, which is incredible. It's just about the numbers, totally about the numbers. So what he's having to do all the time, he's having to manage his stakeholders who are just about the numbers, but he's wanting to bring in humanity. He's wanting to bring in purpose. He's wanting to bring in absolute humility. His whole thing is, look, you know, test and learn, and progress, not perfection. And we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to learn and grow together. And he does that right across the board: research, operation, right through to sales, the customer, marketing. So every area of the business, finance, we've heard quite a bit about empowerment. He really gives his team the autonomy they need to be themselves, hugely encouraging in this time right now. With back to office, we're having big conversations with his wider leadership team. It's all about flexibility. It's all, and again, he's getting a lot of pressure from stakeholders to be very compliant. So I think that it shows up in multiple ways. But for me, the number one thing is, as a leader, you know, if you've not thought about this stuff, if you are not living and breathing this stuff, you cannot fake it. You can't pretend. You cannot engage thousands of colleagues on a journey, because it is a journey where you, again, you know, you've got to deliver the numbers. I get it. That's point of entry. But to do that in a purposeful way, with humility, by example, with authenticity, with humanity, you know, generating relationship, etc., etc. You cannot fake it. So it's got to be real. And the one point, I've been studying a lot about trust recently, and it's very interesting, because actually, if you look at the neuroscience of trust, and there's a neuroscientist, Paul Zak, that's done quite a lot of work on this, it's actually linked to a hormone, oxytocin. And oxytocin is the social bonding hormone. So this is very tangible. And actually, again, you know, they've done research where you can measure trust. You can actually see the frequency of trust through our neural mirrors and how much I trust you or not. So you can't fake this. You've got to think about it. You've got to have a strategy around it. Otherwise, you will absolutely get caught out.
Thanks, Ben. And if you want to read anything more about Paul Zak, it's a great Harvard Business Review article published a couple of years ago, which talks about some of the conditions that will generate high levels of trust. Paula, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount to add because I agree, you know, purpose is absolutely key. I suppose the only other thing I think about what are leaders doing actively to show up in this way is service, ultimately. And I suppose, you know, this is sometimes described as humble leadership or humility or whatever. Fundamentally, for me, this is absolutely about the fact that hierarchy, I love and hate hierarchy, right? I don't think that hierarchy shouldn't exist. I don't understand how in big systems of people, you can create organization without some degree of organization of people. But hierarchy can end up being misinterpreted to power. And that's a really, really difficult situation, because actually everybody should be in service of the purpose, the mission of the organization, what you're trying to achieve, and everybody should be in service of each other. No one more so than the leader, whose aim is actually to create, as I've talked about before, this kind of collective agency. So I think purpose and service together really come back to, you know, the principles that I write about, which is purpose is about clarity, service is about being out of the way. And if you do those two things, and that's how you spend your time, you can't go far wrong when you start to get pulled into the busyness of things. Using those two things to pull yourself back and reflect on enables you to, you know, reach that. And the other thing I would say about perfect, and I love, Lorna, I see you've got it in there, awesome, not perfect. You know, and the whole point that you were talking about, Ben, about, you know, it's not about perfection, it's progress. I think leaders also, you know, sometimes we can be a bit critical here that perhaps, you know, there is a bigger job to do as leaders. It's really hard. And I think as long as we are intentional about what we're trying to do as leaders, and we're prepared to pull ourselves back and check in on ourselves as leaders, that is the best that we can do. And sometimes we will get it wrong. And then we just have to, you know, have that open dialogue and open conversation, and maybe ask for help. Maybe ask for help.
Yeah,
Really?
one of the points I think, again, Marina, you made is the sort of support needed around leaders, you know, that sense of asking for help, or I think feedback or conversation, or people helping you to see your blind spots, or just helping you to be more humble. But that sense of people around you, it's not a solo endeavor. Where have you seen that work best? Have you got any examples of people who really gather others around them well to help them perform their leadership role more effectively?
Yeah, look, just jumping in there. Again, I mentioned, you know, Heathrow, and the CEO there, John Holland Kay, he's a great example of this, where, yeah, he's got a background as a strategist. He was a consultant, and, you know, he's got a very, very complex role now. His number one kind of principle as a leader is get a great team around you. And so his first thing is like, get the right people around you to complement you and your skills. So he's very cognizant of his own strengths and weaknesses. He absolutely ensures that he's got a very rounded team in order to support that. And then together, collectively, you know, they then create the strategy, get excited about it, and then he lets people get on with it. And that literally, you know, is his philosophy as a leader.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on Mark. And Mark, it's great to reconnect with you in terms of the development of empathy as leaders. And, you know, is that possible? And to become an authentic empathizer. Obviously, I'm biased on this because I develop leaders. So, you know, every leader I get to, are they highly empathetic? Absolutely not. You know, are we born with tremendous empathy? Absolutely not. Now, we might have a leaning towards it, but I think empathy is absolutely one of those qualities that can be developed if you want to. Um, and that really is the key. And I do think that what I have seen is qualities like humility and empathy and compassion and sensitivity. All of these tend to be developed in leaders as a consequence of a real fundamental need. Yeah. And it reminds me of one leader who was, he'd gotten 360 feedback. He was in line for succession for a very senior executive role. And the feedback came back that number one gap was empathy. And he was a CFO at the time. And I remember when I sat down with him with his feedback, he really didn't like the look of the feedback or the look of me, but we found some common ground. And I asked him what was his philosophy about leadership. And he said, I'm not a leader, I'm a technocrat. You know, no interest, although he was managing 3,000 people at the time, no interest in leadership. But we went on a journey. And actually the catalyst of that was feedback. And he had to take it on board and he had to take it to heart that unless he really, really started listening to others, demonstrating care, putting that into action, he was not going to progress. So I think whatever the trigger for people, and it's various, but without a doubt, the critical ingredient for empathy is listening.
Thanks, Ben. I want to just pick up on this emotional side. So I don't know what other people's experiences are, but when I talk to leaders about the place for emotion in the workplace, I often get a very mixed response. And dealing with feelings and that emotional side is something that many in leadership positions find quite challenging. And I know that we've got Matt Stevens, I think, on the call. And Matt, I think you've been doing some research around this in terms of employee experience and the place for emotion and feeling. And I'd like to bring you in, if I could, with some perspectives on that, because I suspect that many of us bump up against these challenges. If you can come off mute, or someone can bring you off mute. Matt, do you want to share some perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me to speak. And first, quick congratulations to Paula. Thrilled for you. I remember 2 years ago you talked about, I think I've got a book in me, and I just, you know, I know you don't need this said, but for everyone on this, you know, you truly have lived that book. I've watched you do that over the 2 years, and particularly that building trust, because I can remember you kind of staring at me going, do I trust this guy and share a little bit about what's in my book and what I want to put in there? And you did. I can remember that at the lunch we had, and you started to share and said, look, I just want to give you some of the ideas. I'd love to get your feedback. So yeah, it's you truly live it as well as write it. But yeah, Mark, you're right. So I'm founder, CEO of a company called Impulse, where we measure emotions. And actually very fortunate to be published by Lid as well. Wrote a book called The Engagement Revolution, which is very much looking at engagement isn't a static, finite thing. It's an infinite thing. If any of you know that work, William Bridges, and it's really looking at how it's constantly changing. And for me, it's been very much more about how people are feeling, their experience, which comes often to their emotions. And I give that as a bit of context because what it means is on every single survey, and we work with about 400,000 employees across the world. I can't remember how many companies, but effectively we're asking them on a quarterly, sometimes monthly basis, how do you feel about working at Heathrow, for example, and why do you feel that way? And what's been super interesting, beyond, I mean, the results are fascinating. We published a lot of it over last year where we saw a huge rise in anxiety and stress because of everything that was going on with COVID. And we could see the reasons why, which is actually, interestingly, mainly workload, which then led to well-being and then led to job security fears. But the question I'd love to ask the two of you, because I'm going to violently agree with a lot of what you said, Ben and Paul. It's fantastic and exactly the space and conversations we need to be having to move corporate world a little bit. But question for me is, when the managers and the leaders at the organizations we work with, they get their data back. And we always say, look, the data's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what you do with it next, but it's actually can be very helpful to you. But they're suddenly getting in front of them results that say 40% of their people feel anxious, and here's the reason why. And 30% of your people feel hopeful, and here's the reasons why. That's really different from most sort of, particularly their history of maybe how engagement's been, where they've got a numeric back. We're 0.027 better than we were a year ago, which is very left brain, very easy to handle compared to this emotions and the reasons why. And I'm going to be very honest with everyone. The hardest thing we have is the culture change required with the organizations we work with. And obviously I had the pleasure of working with Paula at FDM when she was there. So I'd love to know from you, both of you, because finally agree 2020 is going to be about empathy. It's going to be about compassion. It's going to be about emotional intelligence. But practically, because we get asked this all the time, on a really practical, earthy basis, how do we help managers have these conversations about these sticky things like emotions and feelings that they can be very afraid to do? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
I'll share a couple of things. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. And I just think, you know, the first starting point is even asking the right questions. Right? So actually putting the conversation about feelings into the context of the workplace, because, you know, we're human beings, rounded human beings who have feelings. So to not have a conversation about feelings is sort of not really okay. In terms of preparing people to be able to deal with that information and do something useful with it, there's actually quite a bit of jeopardy here. And for anyone who's an HR professional on the call today, you'll feel that jeopardy keenly. How much do you share? How much can you trust, you know, your leaders to be able to have the right conversation when that very sensitive information gets into their hands? How vulnerable does it make someone feel? And how equipped are they to handle that vulnerability in order to have the right conversation? When we introduced I'll just share what we did actually. So, and I think it's a journey to use that phrase. But when we introduced this kind of concept around feelings and data around feelings, we didn't introduce it just on its own as a survey. And we put together, you know, support that sat around it to help people have the conversation. I completely agree. The data is the data. But the most important thing is the ability to be able to have a conversation that results in a deepening of trust and support both ways. And I really like the previous example, actually, Ben, that you gave of the challenging conversation you had to have with a leader. You know, this type of information will make a lot of people feel really, really uncomfortable. And I think our job is not to judge people for that being uncomfortable, but to help provide support and ways through and partnership and coaching and all the things that sit around to help people realize that this, although this might feel uncomfortable, it's amazing what happens on the other side of that discomfort. And I think the stories that we're starting to be able to build to help people take that journey and use information like this in the right way is amazing. So they're the sorts of things that I think are in mind, but I'd really worry about the information just being out there on its own as data without having some good support and connective support available for leaders to help work out how best to do it. And I loved your point, Ben, because actually the most important thing that a leader can do in this instance is just listen. If you don't know what to do, if you feel vulnerable and you don't know what to do, don't do anything. Just ask a question or listen.
That's really a good way to summarize it. Ask a question and then listen rather than answer your own question. Melinda Dixon has talked about how do we get honest feedback, and you know, how do we create the environment where that's safe to happen. And I hope, Melinda, quite a few points have come up in that conversation that we've just had that speaks to that question. But I think my own understanding of neuroscience is the best way to encourage an environment of feedback is to actually ask for it yourself. And if you, in your position as a leader, wherever you sit in the organization, keep asking people for feedback, the chances are it will encourage them to ask for it as well. I think I'm right on that. I would like to move into a couple of other areas while we have time. And I'd like to bring Lorna in, if I can. And we've talked about a lot about self, we've talked about a lot about leading in the context of organization, but I want to take it a little bit further about the organization or the leader as an instrument for change within society, and particularly that sense of the environment, the social, the governance, the sort of responsibility of a leader to care for not just the organization they're entrusted with, but through the organization to the world around them. So Lorna, I hope that little intro has enabled you to come off mute and to share some thoughts around that.
Thank you, Mark, and this is absolutely fascinating, and it's lovely when you come on. I'm reminded you as a behaviouralist will love the thinking fast and slow reference, but I love this because this is absolutely my thinking fast, absolutely, because you're all ticking all my boxes of all my things of reciprocity and trust and leaps of faith and everything, and I just feel cosseted because, you know, I'm clearly in the groove, so thank you for my afternoon fix. But talking about all of this, there is a problem, I think, in the sense that leadership becomes this never-ending list of things rather than actually a central core tenet that drives. And people talk about psychological safety, but in the end, psychological safety is driven by confidence and belonging. You know, we've moved through inclusion. Inclusion means it's about belonging, because many of you as academics will understand the study of covering, where we've spent since we came out of the cave time, you know, trying to be part of the herd to not get picked off. But actually the drive in highest performance is about realizing that your difference is your superpower now. It's not about how you fit in, it's about what your difference is. And one of my questions is about, all of a sudden, after decades of people pushing, the investment community has now all of a sudden taken to ESG. But how much do we genuinely think that they understand that right at the core of delivering on E and S and G, to deliver that, you know, the whole subliminal thing of sustainability is about creating that confidence and belonging, because you will not get a group of people being able to talk truth to power to stop you doing something that's environmentally good but socially bad, you know, or governance good and all the other things, unless that's right at the core. And so I'd be very interested on Ben's and Paula's take on how we can use E, S and G, and what you think the understanding is out there at the moment, and how we can flip the thought leadership on in terms of the core of what leadership is to actually include this, what we're talking about.
Great, and I'm going to give you both about 30 seconds each to respond to that. This is probably a webinar in its own right, I think, but there's one other question I want to come to before we close up for today. So, Paula, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, and it's just to even pose it, I think, is for all of us to make sure that we take that away and really consider how we as leaders in the world start to impact that. The key for me on this is going to be the organisations that are already doing it, that prove it. And it's already happening. There's organisations out there that are absolutely focused on a broader systemic impact in the world, not just profit as part of it, but profit as a driver to create social and environmental good. And those organisations will demonstrate that this is not a choice. It's not either choose environmental and social aspects of your business or profit. It's actually an and growth. And the organisations that start to demonstrate that will wake up all the other organisations and the investors to say, and that's where the sustainable investment can be made. So that's my wish and my honest belief.
Thank you.
Lorna, look, thank you. It's such a massive topic. So, look, a couple of quick points from my end. So, number one, I think, look, the next generation Thank goodness. I think, you know, they're going to absolutely vote with, you know, where they're going to choose to work. And I think as an organization today, if you do not have a clear point of view in terms of doing good is good for business, you will not attract the next generation, because their choices are very, very different. That would be number one. Number two, again, I think, look, it's a huge learning curve. My experience is that what I notice with most organizations, they get there because they have to. There are some that are obviously ahead of that curve. But again, I would totally echo what Paul is saying there. But I do love examples, whether you agree with them or not. But if you like, take a Whole Foods, they started out as a bunch of hippies. It was a community. They sell to Amazon for 13 billion. Now, whether you agree with Amazon or not, it's not really the point. The point is that you can absolutely have ESG at the heart of your business and make a lot of money as well.
Thank you both. We're still getting questions coming through, and sadly we're not going to be able to cover them all, but John Alcock, John, it's great to have you on the call. John has asked about those who are in sort of technical roles and that they aspire to be leaders. And I think the question is, as a coach, many I speak to regard leadership as the goal. How do you reset expectations and show that aspiring to be an expert technocrat is not an admission of career failure? It's a really interesting one, and probably that association of leadership with a role rather than the sort of underlying mindset, behaviors, attitudes, predispositions to how you work with others lies behind that. But I'm going to throw that out. Paula, Ben, whichever one would like to catch it. That will be the last question, and I'm going to hand over to Paula.
Yeah, I'll actually share something on that, and I'll be quite brief on it. And because I really, really understand this, I've worked in every single organization I've worked in has had a dominant technical function. And people from that dominant technical function have often found themselves accidentally in leadership because there is no other way of finding status, recognition, growth in your career in whatever way you describe it. One of the ways in which I think, you know, and I've certainly tried to change this in organizations as chief people officer, is look for three-dimensional organizations so that people have a choice, and you present people with a choice around whether they choose leadership or they choose growth in their mastery of their technical capability. And then the organization needs to be able to support that somehow to make sure that people can experience that growth if they do not choose leadership. But I think that is often not presented as an option in organizations, and yet organizations are absolutely reliant on these people with technical capability. But we merge the two roles rather than give people options for choosing them. And that therein lies a fundamental challenge around hierarchy, status, reward and recognition, etc. But it's not unresolvable at all. And it's really, really important that we value that and give people choices. Not everyone is or wants to be a leader. But if we provide people with no alternatives, they'll take those roles, and we'll continue to see some of the challenges that we have, you know, associated with it.
Thank you, Paula. Ben, anything else to add on that?
No, very comprehensive and just mindful. That's great.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you all for your contributions. The chat box has been absolutely buzzing. Paul, sorry we didn't get to your question about people setting up new businesses without leadership experience. And I would have loved to have tackled the whole issue of collective agency a bit more and much more as well. But Paula, I'm going to hand back to you because I know that you're going to take us into a close. Thank you all very much, and I'll sign off at this point. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I've just got a very couple of brief things I'd like to say before we close the session this afternoon, and some thank yous. So and what I would say on the chat function is I will look through this full chat afterwards. And if there's any questions we haven't answered, I'll pick up on them afterwards as well directly. So I will do that. Francesca, could we have just the last couple of slides up? So first of all, what I would say is when I wrote this book, it wasn't meant to stand alone. It was really meant to create the start of a conversation. And so I did want to share with you that one of the things that I've been passionate about doing, and I finally got the chance to do, was to create this community for leaders. It's a private group. I will share the link with you. If you want to support this work, I would love it if you might like to join or share it with leaders in your network. This is a safe space for us to really explore for any leaders who want to make a difference and lead with their heart. So that's something as an extension of the book. If we can have the next slide, please. I just want to commend this particular group of books for your bookshelf. So obviously, there is this particular one that we've been talking about today, my book Vantage Points. But here is an example of Ben's work. Obviously, he's published many books. This is his most recent work, Being. I really recommend it. If you're interested in leadership more broadly, you know, there's lots of different ways that you can access this. So these are two wonderful books I'd love to share with you. Mark's book, he mentioned fairly humbly at the beginning, but he has a wonderful book that came out about maybe about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, called Risky Business, which is fantastic and quite fun too. Got lots of different characters in it that you can get to know, and helps you to kind of make sense of decision making. And as Matt contributed today, I also wanted, you mentioned your book, Matt, but it's on our recommended bookshelf here as well, The Engagement Revolution. So if you're looking for a new leadership book to recommend to anyone you work with or to read yourself, that's for your bookshelf. Thank you so much. And then finally, I just have some thank yous. So first of all, if you can just change the last slide, please there, Francesca. So first of all, I do need to just thank Francesca, who's on the line today. It's been quiet in the background, but very active in helping me in terms of promoting the book since I wrote it. So thank you so much. And also to Alec and Martin, I know you're on the line from LID. Thank you so much for all your support in making the book come to life. I'd like to thank Katie Jacobs, Maggie Smith, Vlad Kalupik and Mark Withers for your wonderful endorsements of the book. It's the most terrifying thing, writing a book and then asking people to say something nice about it. And you've all been so generous, so thank you so much. I'd very much like to thank Ben for his time today. Wonderful contributions, great to riff with you today on this subject. Just really, really wonderful to have you supporting us and part of this discussion for this community. To Lorna and Matt, thank you so much for bringing your contributions today. It's been fantastic. Really, really appreciate it and generating that extension to our conversation. And to Mark for hosting today, done an absolutely wonderful job, as I knew that you would. Yeah, really, really appreciative of everything that you've done to support me, but also to bring this conversation to life today. And to you all for being part of what I hope was an energizing conversation. And has given you some food for thought on this Monday afternoon. And it just remains for me to say, if you've read the book, that would be wonderful. If you wouldn't mind writing a review, that would be even more amazing, because it does genuinely make a difference and helps other people to find the work. And please do share that book and share this discussion with anyone who you think might be interested when we share the link. It will probably be in your inboxes tomorrow morning. Thank you all so, so much for your time this afternoon and for being part of celebrating this conversation on leadership. Thank you.